now. A long-running inquiry into contaminated blood has heard how Jeremy Hunt failed to keep his promise to a man in Farnham with terminal cancer. Mike Dorricott died in 2015 from liver cancer that was linked to hepatitis C from a contaminated blood product.
Let's get the background on this from our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Mike Dorricott was a haemophiliac who was infected with hepatitis C as a result of his treatment with blood products. He contracted liver cancer and died in 2015. His widow Anne told the inquiry that the year before they'd been invited to a meeting with Jeremy Hunt to discuss a full and fair settlement. Mr Hunt, she said, had said, "Don't worry, we'll sort it." But she added he hadn't fulfilled his promise. A spokesperson for Mr Hunt said he had launched the full public inquiry in 2017 to give victims the chance to find out what went wrong, and financial support had been increased.
Well, Mr Dorricott's daughter, Sarah, now wants Mr Hunt to sort out a settlement. I spoke to her with her lawyer, Des Collins. She told me all about her dad.
My dad was a very bubbly, friendly man. He was very hardworking and, he worked hard for his family and provided us with everything we could ever need. In the later years of his life, we were very good friends. I spoke to him daily. I'd ring him, and he was very much a friend as well as a dad.
He did campaign for compensation, and we understand he met his local MP in South West Surrey in 2014. So presumably that was when Mr Hunt was Health Secretary.
Yes, my dad and his constituent MP, Jeremy Hunt, at the time was Secretary of Health, and he would speak to my dad on a number of occasions, and they were on a first-name basis. That he called my dad Mike, and my dad called him Jeremy. And he invited my dad and my mum to Westminster to have a meeting about what would be a fair and final settlement on behalf of all the victims of the contaminated blood scandal.
And what exactly was the promise? What did he promise him?
Well, my dad worked very, very hard on what would be a number, a figure, and how can you put a price on someone's life? You can't do it; it's impossible. So he came up with lots and lots of figures, and he worked it all out. And my dad was very, very intelligent, and he proposed these figures to Jeremy Hunt. He also came up with a system of how it could be fairly worked out for all the victims. And Jeremy Hunt was told that my dad was also terminal and he had 12 months left to live. And Jeremy Hunt said to my dad and my mum, who was also in the room, that don't worry, we'll sort this out. And obviously Jeremy Hunt was quite moved at the fact that my dad had just divulged to him that he was terminal, and it was very emotional. So having said this devastating news to him, and to have received this response to someone who was effectively a dying man, we'd expect a lot more action from him. And since that meeting 5 years ago, nothing has come of it. Jeremy Hunt has said himself that, or a spokesperson for Jeremy Hunt has said, Jeremy Hunt has worked towards trying to get a public inquiry and increasing support payments. But quite frankly, that's not what he'd promised to my dad in reference to the meeting that he'd had with him.
So let's just bring in Des Collins. So you're the lawyer for the family. Now, what we've heard from Mr Hunt's office, the statement is the Dorricott family are among thousands who have faced tragedy as a result of this appalling injustice. As well as increasing the financial support for victims, Jeremy pushed for this landmark inquiry because those affected have a right to know what went wrong and why. What's your response to that?
Well, I think my response must be that these are just mere words by Jeremy Hunt, and what he's doing is repeating things which have been said in the past, but not getting down to grips with the promise which he made at the time that these issues would be resolved. This wasn't simply a promise to the public. It wasn't simply a promise to his constituents. It was a direct promise to a man with whom he worked closely and who became his friend. And quite frankly, his friend died apparently secure in the knowledge that something was going to be done.
And with Jeremy Hunt in line to become the next Conservative leader and therefore the next Prime Minister, do you think that makes your case more likely or less likely to happen?
We act for about 1,400 of these victims. They are unanimous in saying to Jeremy Hunt, come on, get off the fence. You promised this to Michael Dorricott. You were quite clear in your promise. Now, fulfil that promise now.
Sarah, if we can bring you back in. Obviously, Jeremy Hunt's all over the news at the moment. He's on the front of the newspapers. When you see it, how does that make you feel?
Quite frankly, it makes me disappointed. It makes me disappointed that he's having articles published about promises that he's going to be making if he becomes Prime Minister. And quite frankly, there's still outstanding promises that he made that have not been fulfilled. He did say to my dying father that he would sort this out. He would sort out fair and final settlements for the victims. And since nothing has happened, he said that he supported out additional finances for the support schemes, which make victims jump through hoops. And it's a cap-in-hand begging bowl scheme. They have to provide so much evidence to actually get any support in the first place, which is quite frankly quite traumatic for the victims. What the proposition was to Jeremy Hunt was compensation, which the government and MPs and ministers, they won't admit liability. So compensation is a taboo word. They don't like the word, so they use the word support schemes, and it's almost like a charity. So when I see articles of Jeremy Hunt promising to do this and promising to do that, it's quite frankly like a slap in the face. What happened to the promise he made to my father?
How much of your life is this taking up at the moment?
Well, I work full time as well, and I have a young family. And quite frankly, it fills most of my spare time. I'm constantly on Twitter. I'm trying to gain some kind of response from high-profile people, and it's quite consuming. And a lot of the responses are, well, you're digging up dirt about Jeremy Hunt because of the leadership race at the moment. No, quite frankly, I wrote my witness statement back in January before the leadership race. And it's quite harmful, some of the things that are said online, but it's water off a duck's back. The main game here is to find justice for the victims and to find justice for my father, who was an avid campaigner as well. And we want to see the finish line.
That's Sarah there, the daughter of Mike Dorricott from Farnham. And as we heard there, Mr Hunt's office says, as well as increasing financial support for victims, Jeremy pushed for this landmark inquiry, as those affected have the right to know what went wrong and why. So what happens now? Well, the victims of contaminated blood and their families get financial support intended to cover their living costs. Compensation, though, has not been delivered. And as for the inquiry into the haemophilia scandal, that continues. More than 2,000 people are thought to have died. That's people with haemophilia who picked up hepatitis C or HIV.
The government has announced an increase in financial support to those affected. Amanda Patton's brother, former County Sound radio presenter Simon Cummings, died after contracting HIV from blood given to him by the NHS to treat his haemophilia.
The awful thing is that it was self-administered. So sometime, probably sitting at my mum's kitchen table, one of those doses or many of those doses will have infected him. Seeing my children growing up, the children he might have had, it's all that life that might have been.
So what happens now? Well, the victims of contaminated blood and their families get financial support intended to cover living costs. Compensation, though, has not been delivered. And as for the inquiry into the haemophilia scandal, that continues. More than 2,000 people are thought to have died. People with haemophilia who picked up hepatitis C or HIV. Let's bring in Liz Carroll, the Chief Exec of the Haemophilia Society. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Tell me about the inquiry. You were there when Sarah gave her evidence.
Absolutely, I was. And as Sarah and the rest of her family explained so clearly, this is something that maybe happened in the 70s and 80s, but is still happening today. It has a huge impact on every single family today. Whatever happened in the past, whether their loved one is still alive, whether it's them themselves still infected. And something has to be done now so that people are not living on subsistence payments. They're not having to change their lives dramatically because of what has happened. We need something to happen now, but we also need the inquiry to find out the truth. So at the end of the inquiry, some absolutely full compensation, that may be a whole package of things.
What's interesting is that the stories are very compelling and very moving. Where are we actually at with the inquiry? How much longer do you think it will go on for?
There's certainly a lot more to come. What's happening at the moment is people who are affected by this are able to share their experiences. So the scene is set for what needs to come, which is then an investigation into how did this happen, who made the decisions, why were those decisions made, looking right from government all the way through. So it will be several years before we come to a conclusion and truly understand what has happened. And that's why families like Sarah's and many others can't wait until the end of the inquiry for some additional help now. They need something now. About 4 people a week are dying from this at the moment. Those people who know that it's going to be them need to know their families are not going to be left destitute, really.
Good talking to you. Thank you. Liz Carroll, the Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society. And as we heard there, Mr Hunt's office says that as well as increasing financial support for victims, Jeremy pushed for this landmark inquiry as those infected have a right to know what went wrong and why.
And it's our top story this morning. An inquiry into contaminated blood has heard how Conservative leadership contender Jeremy Hunt failed to keep his promise to a man in Farnham with terminal cancer. Mike Dorricott died in 2015 from liver cancer linked to hepatitis C from a contaminated blood product.